She thought he was just another broke cowboy, dust on his boots, secrets in his eyes. But the night the bullets flew and the truth shattered, she realized. He wasn't just a drifter. He was the man who once ruled half the state and the man who might save her life. Stay with us because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about love, betrayal, and second chances. The Wyoming plains stretched endless and golden under the heavy weight of the afternoon. Sun. Dust clung to every surface, turning even the sky a weary shade of amber. Samantha Hart sat on the hood of her broken-down truck, the engine still ticking with heat, and stared out at the wavering horizon. Her hands were grease-streaked, her boots scuffed, and her heart worn thin from a lifetime of fighting battles that nobody saw. 15 miles from Hart Ranch and no help in sight. Her phone was dead, the spare battery she'd sworn she'd packed still sitting on the kitchen counter. Coyotes were starting to howl in the distance, and the first shadows of twilight were creeping over the hills. She tightened her grip on the wrench in her lap, pushing down the slow creeping unease in her chest. The sound of hoofbeats, soft but steady, broke the silence. She squinted into the settling dust and saw him, a lone rider on a black horse moving toward her like a ghost conjured from the very earth itself. He wore a battered Stetson pulled low against the sun, his denim shirt the same worn blue as the endless sky behind him. For a moment, Samantha thought she might be hallucinating. The horse slowed to a walk a few yards away, and the rider tipped his hat back, revealing a rugged, shadowed face. His voice, when it came, was low, calm, and edged with something that was almost kindness. "You look like you could use a miracle or a mechanic." Samantha tensed, the wrench clutched tightly in her fingers. She didn't trust strangers. Out here, trust could get you killed. But there was something in the way he sat the saddle, easy but alert, that spoke of a man who knew how to handle trouble without making a show of it. "Depends on which one you're offering," she said, voice dry as the dirt beneath her boots. He smiled, a slow, almost reluctant curve of his mouth. "Left my miracle kit back in Deadwood, but I can take a look at that engine if you want." The sun was sinking fast now, bleeding its last light across the plains. Samantha glanced at her dead phone, then back at him. No good choices, only the least bad. She nodded once. Truck overheated. Or maybe worse. "I'm not sure." He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. Moving with a kind of patient confidence, he came to stand beside her. Not too close, not too far. He smelled faintly of leather, horse, and the wide wild outdoors. "Mind if I?" he asked, motioning to the hood. She nodded again and stepped aside, watching him carefully as he pulled a rag from his saddlebag and leaned over the engine. His movements were sure, practiced. No fumbling, no unnecessary chatter. "Name's Jackson," he said after a moment, his voice muffled by the hood. "Samantha." He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Radiator's shot. You'll need a tow." Samantha muttered a curse under her breath. "Figures." She kicked the tire again for good measure, dust rising around her boots. "I've got a ranch about 15 miles west. Hart Ranch," she said finally. "There's a trailer there, another truck. If you want, I can help you hitch it," Jackson offered easily. "Safer than staying out here after dark." Samantha hesitated. Trust didn't come easy, not after everything she'd fought to hold on to. But something in Jackson's steady gaze told her that, at least for tonight, he meant no harm. "Deal," she said, tossing the wrench into the truck bed. It took them the better part of an hour to rig the broken truck to his horse. Samantha walked beside him at first, determined not to show weakness. But the cold came fast once the sun slipped below the horizon, and eventually Jackson swung her up behind him without asking. His body was solid and warm beneath the thin fabric of his shirt, but he kept his distance as much as he could, giving her space even when space was impossible. They moved in silence across the plains, the stars sharpening above them one by one. Samantha found herself listening to the sound of the horses breathing, the rhythm of hoofbeats, and the quiet strength in the man leading them home. When the lights of Hart Ranch came into view, Samantha felt a knot loosen in her chest. The old wooden sign, worn but proud, caught the moonlight. Hart Ranch S 1982. Home. Jackson helped unhitch the truck without being asked, moving with the same silent efficiency he'd shown all evening. He didn't try to linger, didn't ask for anything more than a corner to rest. "You any good with tools?" she asked as they stacked the last of the gear. "Depends on the job," he replied, dusting off his hands. "I've got a busted fence, leaky barn roof, a stubborn mare who thinks she's queen of the damn world." Jackson tipped his hat back and gave a short, amused nod. I can stay a few days. Help you patch things up. Samantha studied him in the moonlight. He looked like a man built for long roads and longer silences, not someone meant to stay anywhere, for long. But right now she needed the help more than she needed answers. Few days, she agreed, almost against her better judgment. Inside the small kitchen, she ladled out bowls of stew and set fresh cornbread on the table. Jackson ate without hurry, savoring each bite like a man who appreciated a good meal but wasn't starving. He never asked for more than what was offered, never took what wasn't his. Samantha found herself watching him from across the table, wondering again what road had led a man like him to a broken truck and a lonely ranch at the edge of nowhere. You ever settle anywhere? She asked, swirling the whiskey in her glass. Jackson shook his head, his gaze far away. Not in a long time. Running from something. A shadow flickered across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. Running toward peace, he said simply. The wind outside pressed against the windows, whispering secrets Samantha had no words for. She didn't ask any more questions that night. She didn't need to. She could feel the ghost that clung to him, just as surely as she felt the weight of her own. When she offered him the spare room in the bunkhouse, he accepted with a quiet thank you, tipping his hat in a gesture more sincere than any handshake. After locking the door behind him, Samantha stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the dark fields beyond the porch. There was something about Jackson Turner that unsettled her, and not in a way that warned her of danger, but in a way that hinted at the edges of something she hadn't dared hope for in a long, long time. Not yet trust, not yet hope, but something close, something almost like a beginning. And sometimes, she thought, beginnings didn't announce themselves with fanfare or certainty. Sometimes they arrived like this, quiet, unexpected, and full of dust and stars. The first morning after Jackson's arrival dawned cold and blue. Samantha stood by the kitchen window, cradling a chipped mug of coffee, watching him move through the early mist. He was already in the pasture, working a reluctant mare into a slow walk, his body language calm, patient. Dust clung to his jeans, his hat pulled low over his brow against the rising wind. He looked like he had been part of this land forever, as if he'd simply risen out of the earth when she needed him most. Still, something about him gnawed at her. He worked too quietly, too efficiently. A man who had spent his life on ranches usually bore a certain casual chaos, things half finished, fences patched with wire and prayers. But Jackson moved with precision, as if everything he touched needed to be set right, not just fixed, but restored, made whole. It was the first real crack in the story she had let herself believe about him. Just a cowboy passing through. Later that day, after a lunch of cold sandwiches and too much silence, Samantha found herself drawn to the bunkhouse. Curiosity, she told herself. Not suspicion. Not yet. The bunkhouse was clean but sparse. A bed, a battered dresser, and a small pile of his belongings neatly stacked in one corner. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe some small proof that he was harmless, that he was exactly what he seemed. She found the briefcase tucked beneath the bed, its old leather worn soft at the edges. It wasn't locked, only secured with a clasp. Her fingers hovered above it, heart pounding before she flipped it open. Inside, a neat bundle of papers tied with a cracked leather strap. Land deeds, corporate documents, trust agreements, and there, in elegant bold letters, Turner Holdings. Jackson T. Harrison, CEO. Her breath caught in her throat. She shuffled through the pages, faster now, panic rising. Property records spanning several states, contracts signed in a steady, commanding hand. News clippings yellowed and frayed, detailing the meteoric rise of Turner Holdings and the equally spectacular scandal that had followed. Jackson Turner Harrison wasn't a cowboy at all. He was a man who had once owned half the state, who had disappeared after his fiancee's death in a private plane crash, who had let the world believe he was either dead or disgraced. The man, fixing her fences and leading her horses, wasn't some wandering stranger. He was a man who had lost everything and chosen to vanish. Samantha sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the papers trembling in her hands. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. She thought back to his careful answers, his easy silences. Where he never quite met her eyes when she asked about his past. She had trusted him. Worse, she had started to hope he might be something more. She set the papers back, careful not to disturb them, and closed the briefcase. But the knowledge settled in her chest like a stone. When Jackson returned that evening, the sky bruised purple and gold behind him. He found her waiting on the front porch. She stood with her arms crossed, the fading light throwing sharp lines across her face. He slowed as he approached, reading the tension in her body like a map. "You lied to me," she said, voice low and steady. He didn't ask how she knew. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, as if bracing for a blow he had been expecting all along. "I didn't lie," he said finally. "I just didn't tell. You let me think you were nobody, just some drifter with a sad smile and rough hands. And if you'd known who I was," he asked, something raw slipping into his voice, "would you have let me stay?" Samantha faltered, anger flickering into something messier, harder to name. "You let me trust you," she said, each word a knife she hated herself for wielding. Jackson stepped closer, his face unguarded now, in a way it hadn't been before. "I never asked you to." "But you knew I did," she said, swallowing hard. "Yes," he admitted. "I knew." For a long moment they stood locked in silence. The wind whipped around them, rattling the dry leaves on the porch. Jackson's shoulders, usually so square and sure, seemed to sag under the weight of her disappointment. Samantha shook her head, turning away. She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear the sight of a man who was both exactly who he had pretended to be and someone she couldn't begin to understand. "I can't do this," she said, voice breaking. "I can't have someone in my life whose truths I have to dig out of the dirt." Jackson didn't argue, he didn't beg. He just watched her walk away, his hands curling into fists at his sides, the battle raging inside him written plain across his face. That night, Samantha packed a small bag and left without saying goodbye. She drove down the long dirt road away from Hart Ranch, the headlights cutting through the thick, unforgiving dark. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay. Back at the ranch, Jackson stood alone under the vast Wyoming sky, the stars cold and sharp above him. He looked out over the land, the broken fence lines, the dusty fields, the old windmill creaking in the breeze, and felt the old ache settle deeper into his bones. He had run from his past for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, really seen. And now that he had, he wasn't sure he could survive it. Inside the bunkhouse, the briefcase sat untouched, its contents a silent confession. A life built on ambition and shattered by grief. A man who had traded power for anonymity and still carried the weight of both. Jackson didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch, the night cold enough to bite through denim and skin, and stared out at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, Samantha was driving, her anger and betrayal burning hotter than the stars overhead. He didn't blame her. He had wanted to be just Jackson, just a man who could fix things with his hands and stay invisible. But the truth had followed him, heavy as the saddlebags he'd carried across 100 dusty miles, and Samantha Hart, strong, stubborn, fearless Samantha, deserved more than a ghost. The first pale light of morning found him still sitting there, dust on his boots, regret heavy in his chest. He wasn't sure if she would ever come back. He wasn't sure if he even deserved to hope. But one thing he knew now with painful clarity: running had never brought him peace. And for the first time in a long, bitter stretch of years, Jackson Turner, Harrison found himself wanting, truly wanting, not to run anymore. He wanted to stay, even if it cost him everything. Samantha didn't know how long she drove that night, only that the darkness outside seemed endless, and her own mind even darker. Every mile she put between herself and Hart Ranch felt like ripping out a root she'd spent years planting. She found a motel on the edge of Cheyenne, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the only sound was the hum of a flickering neon light outside. The bed creaked under her weight as she sat down, and for a long time she simply stared at her, hands still dusted with Hart Ranch soil, as if part of the land refused to let her go. She tried to sleep, tried to tell herself she had done the right thing by walking away. Trust mattered, truth mattered, and Jackson Turner Harrison had buried both under silence and half-truths. Yet lying in the stiff, unfamiliar bed, she couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he had steadied the skittish mare with nothing but a hand and a murmur, about the quiet steadiness he had brought into her home without demanding anything in return. She hated that part of her still yearned for him, hated even more the hollow space he had left behind. By morning, she was no closer to peace. Samantha pulled on her boots and wandered into town, hoping to lose herself in the normalcy of other people's lives. She passed the diner, the feed store, the post office, all the familiar fixtures of small-town Wyoming life. But it wasn't. Until she heard the murmurs outside the hardware store that her steps slowed. A small group had gathered, heads bowed over a newspaper someone was holding. The air buzzed with low, tense energy, and Samantha's stomach twisted before she even heard the words. Easton's buying up the valley fast, one man muttered. McKinley's place gone. The Johnsons next, if they're smart, won't be long before he circles back for Hart Ranch. The name hit Samantha like a physical blow. She shoved through the knot of people, snatched the paper from an outstretched hand. The headline screamed across the page, Easton expands empire in Silver Valley. The article detailed how Ray Easton, her former lover, her former mistake, was swallowing up ranches at an alarming pace. Underneath the friendly offers of help and prosperity lay ruthless tactics, legal threats, financial pressure, intimidation. One by one, families who had worked their land for generations were selling or folding under the weight of his ambition. Hart Ranch wasn't just another piece of land to her. It was her father's sweat, her mother's laughter echoing through the fields. It was every stubborn, aching choice Samantha had made to stay when leaving would have been easier. And now, because she had walked away, because she had left it. Vulnerable, Ray Easton was circling like a vulture. The guilt twisted tighter than the anger. Samantha folded the paper under her arm and turned back toward the motel. Her steps urgent now. She needed a plan. She needed help. The truth settled heavy and sure inside her. She needed Jackson. She didn't let herself think too much as she packed up her things and checked out. She didn't let herself consider how he might look at her when she returned. Whether he would be angry or cold, whether he would even still be there. She only knew that no matter what had happened between them, Jackson had stood his ground when it mattered. He had fought for her ranch before he had any reason to. She couldn't fight this battle alone. The road back to Hart Ranch was a blur of dust and regret. When she pulled through the gate, she noticed right away that the land seemed different, not neglected, not broken, but waiting. As if it had missed her too. She found Jackson by the east pasture, repairing a section of fence she hadn't even realized was sagging. His sleeves were rolled up against the afternoon heat, and the young colt Dusty followed him with curious, eager steps. He moved the same way he always had, steady, deliberate, with the patience of a man who knew that true repair took time. When he noticed her truck rumbling up, he didn't freeze or turn away. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and waited. Samantha climbed out slowly, the newspaper clutched in her fist like a weapon she had no intention of using. "I saw the news," she said, her voice low. Jackson nodded once, unsurprised. "Easton's moving faster than we thought." She nodded too, unable to hide the tightness in her chest. "I left," she said, almost whispering. "I walked away." "I know." I said, voice steady. There was no accusation in his tone, no anger. Only fact. It made her throat ache worse than any shouted words could have. "I didn't come back for apologies or explanations," Samantha said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Then why?" Jackson asked. She took a step closer, closing the empty space between them. "Because I need you," she said, the truth cutting clean and deep. Not the drifter who hides behind a dusty hat. Not the man with a past too heavy to carry. "I need Jackson Turner Harrison. I need the man who can fight back." He stared at her for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes. For a terrifying second, Samantha thought he might turn her away. But then he reached into the toolbox at his feet and pulled out a thick folder. "I started working on this after you left," he said, handing it to her. Inside were documents, notes, maps, evidence of Easton's shell companies, patterns of land, grabs, illegal loopholes, forged signatures. It wasn't just a plan. It was a weapon. "Easton's sloppy," Jackson said, voice low. "He thinks no one's paying attention. We can hit him where it hurts." Samantha felt the burn of tears behind her eyes but forced them down. There was no time for breaking now. "Are you sure?" she asked. Jackson gave a small rough laugh. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She clutched the folder, tighter, feeling the weight of it. Feeling the weight of him standing beside her, not running, not hiding, choosing to stay. "Then let's fight," she said. They spent the rest of the day bent over the kitchen table, working out the details, gathering names of ranchers who had been pressured, drafting letters, planning meetings. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinematic. It was hard, gritty work, fueled by coffee that had long since gone cold and the quiet, fierce determination of two people who had lost too much to let anyone take anything more. Outside, the evening faded to indigo. The ranch stretched out around them, battered but unbowed. Samantha caught Jackson watching her once, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Not the smile of a man falling in love, but the smile of a man realizing he might have finally found a place to stop running. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Samantha allowed herself to hope, not just for the ranch, but for them. The town meeting was held in the old community hall, the one with the warped floors and the cracked bell above the door that hadn't rung in years. Yet tonight the place hummed, with tension, the air thick with the scent of dust, coffee, and fear. Word had traveled faster than fire through dry brush. Ray Easton wasn't just after Hart Ranch. He was coming for all of them. Samantha sat near the front, hands folded tightly, in her lap, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. These were her neighbors, her friends, people who had taught her to ride, who had brought casseroles when her mother died, who had shown up with shovels after the flood 3 winters ago. Their faces were lined with worry and exhaustion, and now, because of Easton's greed, they were backed against a wall. Jackson stood at the front, unpolished and straightforward, a stack of papers under one arm. He had shed the drifter's shell completely now. No hat to hide under, no practiced indifference. Just a man standing between a community and a threat too big to face alone. He cleared his throat once and began, his voice rough but unwavering. "I'm not from here," he said, "but I know what it means to lose land you love, to watch it slip away because someone bigger and meaner decides it's theirs for the taking." He laid out the documents he and Samantha had spent nights piecing together. Maps, business filings, evidence of shell corporations, illegal buyouts. Every dirty trick Easton had pulled, spread plain for all to see. "He's cutting deals behind. Closed doors," Jackson said, his voice gaining strength. "Using intimidation, using lies. But if we stand together, if we file an injunction and bring it to light, we can stop him. We can buy time. Maybe even more." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Doubt, hope, fear. It lived in the air between them, thick and real. An old rancher with a face like weathered leather stood up, crossing his arms. "And why should we trust you? You're not one of us." Samantha rose slowly, her voice cutting through the murmur like a blade. "Because he's the only one who stood. Between me and Easton when it mattered," she said. "Because he fought when the rest of us were too tired or too scared. Because right now Jackson Turner Harrison is the only reason Hart Ranch still stands." Silence swallowed the room. One by one people nodded. A teacher who had grown up on a neighboring farm. A widow who ran the general store. A teenage boy in boots too big for his feet. When the old rancher stepped forward and signed the first line on the injunction papers, a collective breath seemed to escape the room. Others followed. One by one, they added their names, their weight, their hope to the battle ahead. By the time the papers were stacked in Jackson's hands, they had enough signatures to move forward. It was a start. Outside, the night air was sharp, with the coming frost. Samantha stood with Jackson under the brittle stars, feeling the fragile strength between them. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I did," he answered simply. "They didn't touch. They didn't need to." Something stronger than hands or words bound them together now. The days that followed blurred into a relentless grind of filings, meetings, and preparations. Jackson drove into Cheyenne to meet with a lawyer he trusted. Samantha rallied the ranchers to spread the word, to prepare for the backlash they all knew was coming. And come it did. 3 nights after the meeting, the first trucks arrived. Their engines growled low in the darkness, headlights cutting across the fields like searchlights. Samantha heard them before she saw them, the vibration of tires on dirt making the windows rattle. Jackson was already moving, shotgun in hand, his face grim. "They're here," he said. Samantha grabbed the old Winchester from above the fireplace and followed him out into the dark. From the shadows by the barn, they watched figures spill from the trucks, 6 men, crowbars, and chains in hand. The kind of muscle that didn't ask questions about the legality of their orders, and standing at the front, as bold as a man who thought he owned the stars themselves, was Ray Easton. He called out into the night, voice sharp and mocking. "Come, on out, Jackson. We both know how this ends." Jackson didn't hesitate. He stepped into the glow of the headlights, the shotgun held loosely but ready. "It ends with you leaving," he said. Ray laughed, mean and bitter. "You think a few signatures are going to stop me? I own this valley." "You might own paper," Jackson said, voice low. "You don't own the people." There was movement to the side, a flicker of light. Samantha turned just in time to see the sheriff's cruiser roll up the dirt road, followed by 2 more. Sheriff Martinez stepped out, his badge catching the light. "Drop the weapons," he ordered. The hired muscle froze, uncertain now that consequences had arrived. Ray, in his arrogance, hesitated a beat too long. Martinez didn't. Within moments, Ray was in handcuffs, spitting curses into the dirt. Samantha stood beside Jackson as the deputies rounded up the others, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. It was over, at least for now. When the last truck disappeared down the road, Jackson turned to her, his face still shadowed with caution. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, emotion rising in her throat. "You?" "Close enough," he said with a weary smile. They walked back to the house together, the field stretching silent around them. The ranch had survived another night. They had survived. Inside, Samantha leaned her rifle against the door and turned to find Jackson watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You didn't run," he said. "Neither did you," she whispered. It wasn't a victory parade. It wasn't a clean, triumphant ending. But it was real. It was earned. Jackson poured them each a cup of coffee, black, strong, grounding, and they sat at the kitchen table as the first faint light of dawn crept over the fields. No grand speeches. No promises that tomorrow would be easier. Just the steady, quiet truth between them. They had fought for Hart Ranch. They had fought for something bigger than land or pride. And somewhere along the way, they had begun fighting for each other. The weeks after Ray Easton's arrest passed in a quiet rhythm that felt both strange and familiar, as if life itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Autumn deepened across Hart Ranch, brushing the fields with gold and fire. The wind grew sharper, the nights longer, and the land seemed to settle into itself, bruised but unbeaten. Samantha and Jackson worked side by side every day, patching what had been broken and building what had never been finished. It wasn't just the physical repairs, the broken fence posts, the sagging barn roof, it was the invisible mending too. The slow, careful stitching back together of trust, hope, and belonging. In the mornings, Jackson would be the first out of the bunkhouse. The steady thud of his boots on the porch, a sound Samantha grew to anticipate with something more than relief. She would hand him a mug of strong coffee without a word, and he would meet her gaze with a quiet nod that meant more than any good morning. Their conversations were never long, but they didn't need to be. The silence between them was no longer filled with unsaid things. It was full, rich, understood. One evening, after a long day of setting new fence lines along the north pasture, Jackson came to her where she sat on the porch, her ledger book forgotten on her lap, watching the last sliver of sunlight slip behind. The hills. He carried something in his hand, a small worn wooden box. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his figure outlined against the twilight, the box resting between his palms like something fragile, sacred. Samantha rose, slowly, sensing the gravity of this moment. "This belonged to my mother," Jackson said, voice roughened not from the wind but from emotion. "She always told me, when you find a place worth staying for, you find a way to build a life there. You don't keep running." He opened the box and held it out to her. Inside was a silver ring, simple but beautiful, its edges delicately engraved with the faintest design of mountain peaks and winding rivers, Wyoming itself captured in miniature. Inside the band, a tiny inscription, barely visible, but written in a careful, loving hand. "Come home when you're ready." Samantha felt the breath catch in her chest. She knew the words. They were the same ones her mother had once written to her. In a letter tucked into an old trunk, a letter Samantha had found years ago after the funeral. Somehow, impossibly, Jackson had taken that memory and turned it into something she could wear on her hand. A promise. A beginning. "I don't need a preacher," Jackson said quietly. "Or a crowd. I don't even need a piece of paper. I just need you." Samantha blinked back the burn of tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here." He smiled then, not the guarded, wary smile he had worn for so long, but something open and fierce and wholly real. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been waiting for her all along. They stood there as the stars came out, the world falling into shadow around them, and neither of them moved. They didn't need to. In that quiet, infinite moment, they had everything they needed. A ranch held together by stubborn hope. A future held together by chosen love. Winter came fast that year, bringing snow that blanketed the fields and turned. The world silver and still. But Hart Ranch didn't sleep. Samantha and Jackson worked through the cold, laying the foundations for something bigger than just survival. They began turning part of the ranch into a community center. A place where veterans could come to heal, where kids who had lost their way could find steady hands to guide them, where neighbors could find refuge when life grew too heavy to bear. Alone. They named it Silver Heart Ranch, a nod to the valley's enduring spirit and the people who refused to let it die. Samantha insisted on keeping heart as part of the name, and Jackson didn't argue. Some legacies deserved to be carried forward. The first to come were a handful of troubled teens sent by tired social workers who had run out of answers. Jackson taught them how to mend fences and train horses, not with lectures or punishments, but with patience and trust. Samantha showed them how to ride, how to read the land, how to lose themselves in something greater than their own pain. Slowly, the ranch filled with life again. Laughter drifted from the barns. Horses whinnied in greeting. Children ran barefoot through the fields, their voices bright against the wind. One spring afternoon, Samantha stood near the corral, cradling her daughter against her chest. The baby had been born in a storm so fierce it had ripped branches from the trees and turned the dirt roads to rivers of mud. Jackson had been there the whole time, steady and fierce, holding Samantha's hand and refusing to leave even when she screamed at him to go find a doctor. He had delivered the child himself, his hands shaking but sure, his voice steady as he whispered encouragement through the storm. They named her Lily Hart Harrison, a name that carried the weight of 2 legacies and the promise of something new. Now Lily slept curled against Samantha's heart, her tiny hand fisted in the fabric of Samantha's flannel shirt. Samantha watched as Jackson knelt beside a young boy in the corral, showing him how to bridle a patient old mare. The boy was laughing, bright and unguarded, and Jackson laughed too, the sound rich and full of life. Samantha felt the warmth of that moment, settled deep in her bones. She had spent so long fighting to survive, she had almost forgotten what it meant to truly live. Jackson glanced up and caught her watching him. He smiled, a quiet, private smile meant only for her. And she smiled back, feeling the familiar rush of love, fierce and steady. The ranch would never be easy. The land was too wild, the seasons too harsh. There would always be fences to mend, roofs to patch, storms to weather. But for the first time, Samantha knew she wasn't fighting alone. She was building something with him, together. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields turned the color of old gold, Samantha and Jackson rode out to the highest ridge on the property. They sat side by side on horseback, the wind tugging at their jackets, the wide world stretching out before them. Below, the ranch glowed with life, lanterns swinging gently on the porches, smoke curling from chimneys, laughter rising faintly on the breeze. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. Jackson reached over and took Samantha's hand in his, their fingers tangling easily, naturally, like 2 pieces of the same whole finally finding their way home. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up the empire. The power?" He thought for a long moment, his thumb brushing over the curve of her knuckles. "No," he said. "Not once." She leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes to the steady beat of his heart. In the distance, the mountains stood like sentinels against the sky, ancient and patient and enduring, just like them. And as the stars bloomed into the darkening sky, Samantha Hart Harrison knew without a shred of doubt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home. At last. In the end, Samantha and Jackson's story is not simply about saving a ranch or confronting an enemy. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the way broken hearts can find their way back to trust, how wounded souls can heal when they choose courage over fear. Their journey reminds us that love is not built on grand gestures or flawless beginnings, but in the daily choice to stand beside someone, to build something true from the ruins of old battles. Hart Ranch, once on the edge of collapse, became a living symbol of hope, perseverance, and the quiet power of staying when everything else tells you to run. It teaches us that redemption is always possible, that second chances are not given. They are fought for step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. If this story stirred something within you, if it reminded you that no past is too broken and no dream too distant to chase, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating heartfelt stories that touch the soul and inspire new beginnings. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join a community that believes in the enduring power of love, resilience, and hope. Let's continue this journey together.